Hey y'all, welcome to today's show. We'll get into the Seventh Commandment today, and you're going to find this very interesting. Father Sparago's classic work, The Exhaustive Explanation of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, just never fails to unfold teachings that, are overlooked. I mean, as good as the modern catechism is, and it is quite good, in all honesty, Father Sparago's book should really be a companion. I'm not going to say it's better, but you will understand far more. And even, the catechism's pretty darn long, actually. What is it, about 700 pages, 600 pages or something, right? Father Sparago's book will enlighten you every step. And I think it's really fantastic. In fact, I would say it's really no coincidence that Pope St. John Paul II was the one who encouraged, who authorized and made sure we had a new catechism. He was Polish and Father Sparago was Czech. And I would not be at all surprised if he wasn't very much influenced by Father Sparago's book. A lot of his writings I've seen kind of echoed in Father Sparago's book from 1890. And, it probably was in his library. He probably read it. I really do consider it to be essential Catholic reading, and I enjoy it too. It's actually not an uninteresting book to read. I mean, Father Sparago had a little bit of sense of humor and a nice way of writing. I mean, he really, somewhat poetic at times. But before we get into that, we'll go to Radio Replies, where the anti-Catholic is asking these two priests some very pointed questions. It says, let us turn to the priesthood of the Catholic Church. Is not all priestcraft a product of man's fear? And this is a very, being against the priesthood is really at the heart of Lutheranism. And Lutheranism is essentially the foundation upon which all Protestantism is built upon. And You'll hear this a lot from anti-Catholics. They really hate priests. You would think that they would say, okay, there's someone who's devoted his life to serving God, who's been to a seminary, who has taken a vow of poverty, who does nothing but, read the Bible and religious books and try to help people and visit people in hospitals and all that. No, they actually really hate priests. And when I say that, at the heart of Protestant doctrine, I think it is actually satanic. And I think that those who are truly anti-Catholic bigots may even be demon-possessed. Why else would one hate a priest? And you can look in history, you can see they went pretty darn far with it. I mean, look at, in Germany, when Luther convinced the princes of Germany, to make that sort of like the official religion, but especially in England. I mean, Cromwell. I mean, they hunted priests down and killed them. There is nothing peaceful or good about Protestantism. It was really violent when these Protestants took over these countries and continued. I mean, the persecution of the Irish, the enslavement of the Irish, the genocide, essentially, of the Irish, what the English did to the Welsh and Scots, the French Revolution, the Masonic Order, the Ku Klux Klan, which is essentially the Masonic Order, by the way, the militant wing of the Democrat Party. It's not, if Christianity is a religion of peace and of love, you can't look at Protestantism and say that, right? I mean, people will say, well, what about the Spanish Inquisition? Well, what about the Spanish Inquisition? First of all, it was done by the government of Spain, and people actually chose to be tried by the church rather than be tried by the secular government because they thought they'd get a fair trial. And there weren't just a handful of people that were ever faced prosecution. The numbers that Protestants were like, I was on Twitter, and this girl said something like 30 million, she said 100 million people were killed in the Spanish Inquisition. And I went back and said, The entire population of Spain wasn't even 1 million people, or well, maybe it was right around 1 million people at this time. Where are these 100 million people buried? What evidence, what records do you have of this? This is just complete BS. And of course, she blocked me, and after calling me a satanic. So that's the way it usually goes with anti-Catholics. So anyway, let's get to their answer. So priestcraft, if you call it, is a product of man's imagination, superstition, and perhaps fear. But priestcraft has nothing to do with the Catholic Church. The Catholic priesthood is a very different thing and is a divine institution and can be proved. They said, then why are Catholics so afraid of their priests? And they answer, why do you think they are? If I were to ask you suddenly, why are all people of English descent born cross-eyed? You would be rather astonished for a moment, to say the least. When I was a small Protestant boy, I used to fear the very sight of a Catholic priest, and I used to think that Catholic children must be equally terrified. I am a Catholic priest today, and I have never seen the faintest sign of fear on any Catholic face when I have appeared in the scene. And, anti-Catholics make assumptions such as that because they're actually taught to fear priests. The person says, I have never heard any Protestant clergyman speak as severely to his people as do Catholic priests. Well, I'd say that's I wish that were the case. I wish Catholic priests could be a little more tough in the pulpit, speaking against abortion, homosexuality, especially divorce, and many things. They answer, that is because Catholic priests alone are conscious of the authority to guide their people, but they do not speak severely, they speak earnestly, because they do not wish to see their people running the risk of eternal loss. They speak at times with just indignation because they are charged with the protection of God's interest. No Catholic priest has ever spoken more strongly than the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah. And the person says, priests have rendered dying people unhappy with their insistent demands that they should receive the last sacraments. So those priests would have been more comfortable at home reading some pleasant book. Why should they put themselves out like that? Look at the thing from a Catholic standpoint. A priest is obliged to do all he can that not one soul be lost through his indifference. If he knows that a Catholic is dying, he must do all he can to bring that soul to a good frame of mind before actual death. And the more such a priest does not want, and the more such a soul does not want to rectify things, the more the soul needs the help of a priest. Uneasiness for a few moments before death is nothing compared to uneasiness for all eternity. And if after a few moments of uneasiness a man dies repentant with the last rites of the church, he will bless for all eternity the priest who has used unselfish zeal to labor for his conversion. And the person, this will be the last one we do, the person says, priests themselves are not holy. I knew a very bad priest. And they answer, would you condemn a whole family as criminal because one child went wrong? An unworthy priest does not inspire you with half the indignation he inspires Catholic hearts. But try to grasp this principle. I have never undertaken to defend the conduct of every individual priest, nor for a moment would I wish to defend the evil conduct of anyone. But I say that the Catholic Church is the true church, even though not all her individual members are true to her ideals. No valid arguments can be based upon the conduct of individuals. I might argue against the Wesleyan Church from history, logic, or scripture, but I would not condemn it because of the bad conduct of some Wesleyan minister. Excellent point. Very true. I mean, the first thing the anti-Catholic bigots will hit you with is pedophile priests and all that. And, well, you can actually pull up statistics. And I think this is actually in the Essential Catholic Survival Guide, maybe. I don't know what the modern statistics are. But you can compare how many Baptist ministers, this is somewhere online, I saw it one time, how many Baptist ministers have been arrested or accused of crimes, including rape and pedophilia and all that, as compared to priests. And it's a whole lot more. That's right. The media just doesn't make a big deal over Protestants that do bad things. But, I mean, that's, if you want to do that comparison, go for it. You can definitely shut up a Protestant real quick by doing that if you show them that their denomination it does a lot worse. But again, that's not you don't condemn their entire denomination based on the actions of a few individuals. That's the point that those priests were, trying to make. And what I always say, unless someone really gets in my face about something, then I might use an argument like that. But what I always say is, hey, Jesus chose 12 apostles. One of them was Judas. There will always be bad people within any human institution, even chosen by Jesus himself. So now let's get into Father Spirago's writings on the Seventh Commandment. And the Seventh Commandment, he says, Almighty God forbids us to wrong our neighbor, his goods, and property. Now, this is important because thou shalt not steal and covet and all that. Really puts the Catholic Church, all of Christianity and Judaism, anybody who follows the Ten Commandments, in opposition to communism and progressivism and liberalism. Because it says people have a right to their labor and their property, and you can't take it away from them just because you think they have more than they need. You can't take a man's work and give it to someone else against his will. So, but there's a lot more to it than that, okay? So, by property, he says, is meant all that a man needs for his subsistence and all that he possesses as his own, e.g. his money, clothes, provisions, house, and land. Under the right of possession, he says, earthly goods are necessary to man's subsistence, such as food, clothing, and a dwelling place, money, etc. Consequently, every man is justified in striving to gain earthly goods after a just manner, and in possessing them as his personal property. Since it is the natural right of every man to preserve his own life, he is justified in gaining for himself and keeping as his own those external goods which are indispensable to his existence. If every moment were occupied in providing for his own maintenance, he would be in the direst destitution if sickness or misfortune befell him. The natural law prompts him to provide for such contingencies. In other words, you should have a savings account, and some food stored away, and all the stuff I talk about in my herbal podcasts about prepping and all that, good stuff. Besides, were every moment engrossed with the business of self-maintenance, there would be no time to attend to his eternal interests. Furthermore, a man is bound to provide for those who are dependent upon him, and this he could not do if he himself lived from hand to mouth. God commanded our first parents in paradise to fill the earth and subdue it, Genesis 1:28. Cain and Abel had separate possessions, each one of his own, to offer sacrifice. All trustworthy information respecting the earliest ages of humanity bears evidence to the possession of personal property. It was necessary that each should have his own, otherwise mankind could not have been at peace. There would have been continual strife and contention. Without the right of possession, the incentive of labor would be wanting. The holding of property is therefore an ordinance of God, just as much as marriage and legal authority. So, right there, that's in opposition to communism, socialism. The right of possession is an ordinance of God. But it cannot be said that the distribution of wealth, as it is under the existing circumstances, is in accordance with the will of God, of course. Human nature is sinful, concupiscence. We're greedy, It could not be his will that a small majority should enjoy superfluity, I think is the way you pronounce that word, a lot, in other words, while an overwhelming majority of his children should live in poverty and destitution. This great inequality is the result of sin. Personal property, if justly attained, is justly attained. Personal property is justly obtained when it is either acquired by labor or by gift. Democrats are always saying, he was born into a rich family and he didn't work for it. It's okay. He's due the gift from his ancestors who did work for it. Nature does not give man the right to certain goods. The right to possess them must be acquired. It is acquired in the first place by labor. God has ordained that the earth should not yield what is requisite for the maintenance of human life without cultivation. It is a violation of all justice to deprive the cultivator of the soil what he has won by the sweat of his brow. That's Leviticus 13. And another reason why the Anglican church and Protestant English society was purely evil. I mean, and continues to be in many ways, because what they did to the Irish, they starved people. They took, because they said they were Catholic and they weren't loyal to England. They would not recognize the king as the head of the church. They sold him into slavery. They slaughtered thousands, and then for a couple hundreds of years, took the fruit of their labor and left them in dire poverty and starvation. I mean, look at the potato famine. The Irish did not want to be farming potatoes only. England wanted them to farm potatoes. Then a blight happened, and they, millions starved. Same with on par. I mean, I don't think England's any better than the Soviet Union, who starved so many Ukrainians. This is going back to what, the 30s, 20s, 30s. I mean, they did a genocide, and again in China, they took what the farmers grew and took it away from them and starved them, and slaughtered a lot of them and took their land. No, I don't bow down and worship at England the way a lot of people in this country do. England was a wonderful nation when it was Catholic, and it's been basically purely evil ever since. So, I mean, the influence of England is Protestantism, Freemasonry, slavery. And eugenics, they were real big on eugenics. England was very much allied with Hitler until Hitler wanted to take England. I mean, they were the royal family of England. The Protestant royal family was basically Nazis. Were basically Nazis, and so-called King Charles to this day is essentially a communist. So I don't know what whatever word you want to insert there is so great about England. I mean, and I'm about a third English. My ancestors were English Catholics. The rest is Irish and French. France certainly has a lot of problems too. I'm not just picking on the English because of I have an Irish surname. Really not a good influence in the world, and I don't know why people act like they hung the moon. It's like the English think they're really great, so everybody else does too. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. But anyway, let's get back where I was. All right, so that was Leviticus. If the earth is the Lord's and all that dwell therein, because he is the maker of it, that which man has made must rightly belong to him. Property, as a rule, is gained by work, but sometimes it is a free gift. God himself bestows property. He promised the land of Canaan to Abraham and his posterity as a possession, Genesis 12:7. The patriarchs bequeathed their possessions to the eldest son by a solemn benediction. In the present day, the lands and property of all kind pass into the hands of others by inheritance or bequest. Bequest means gift. Every man should make a will in order to prevent disputes should he suddenly be called out of this life. Believe it or not, it is Catholic teaching that you need to have a will. Has been for a long time. Not something people talk about a lot these days. I can tell you from experience, when there isn't a will, let's just say the grandson that sacrificed everything and went in and took care of the farm, and the ailing grandparent can get cheated out of everything, walk away with nothing and barely the shirt on his back. But you need to make a will. In primitive times, property was acquired by taking possession of unowned land. And now valuables, if unclaimed, may be appropriated by their finder. In other words, somebody lost something and no one claims it, you can keep it. On the other hand, this commandment forbids the acquisition of property by unjust means, i.e. by taking away what belongs to our neighbor. Property is unjustly acquired by theft, robbery, cheating, etc. The state has not the right to take from any man his personal property, but it is empowered to impose restrictions on the acquisition and disposal of personal property. Read that again. The state has not the right to take from any man his personal property, but can regulate the sale and everything of property. See what happens in America if you don't pay your property taxes. America is not a Catholic nation. Should be, isn't. The state has not a paramount command over all property. It has certain rights of supervision, but not of disposal. The people do not exist for the government, but the government exists for the people. Well, yeah, about almost 100 years ago now, when the the federal government, decided to establish the Tennessee Valley Authority. They just took people's homes and flooded those valleys. When they decided they wanted to do the Blue Ridge Parkway and the national forests and all that, again, they basically just took people's property at a tenth of what it was worth, relocated them into little towns, and took their property. That's not moral. And I mean, even, Thomas Jefferson and Madison, I mean, they were Protestants. They were Freemasons. But they didn't sign on to that. That was exactly what they didn't want to happen. So, really, by the time of the Civil War, America had turned its back on all of its founding principles. People say, the Civil War was, free the slaves and it's such a good thing. Getting rid of slavery, yeah, that's a good thing. But turning the federal government and taking away states' rights, turning the federal government into the supreme body that can just take your property, tax your income. None of that is what our founders wanted. That's exactly what they did not want. That was like the entire reason that they justified breaking away from England. But, you're not allowed to criticize Lincoln or Grant and all that, whatever. All right, so we just said the government exists not for the people exist not for the government, but the government exists for the people. Consequently, far from wronging any man, it ought to aim at the welfare of each and all of its subjects. Therefore, if the state compels an individual to give up his property in the public interest, it is bound to give him compensation. That should be just compensation, not pennies on the dollar, which, that's what eminent domain does. They go in and say your property that you could probably sell to somebody for, 250 grand is worth 50, and you have no recourse. You're screwed. And that's the government for you. Nor has the state the right to seize ecclesiastical property. That means Catholic church-owned property, of which it has done quite a bit in America. And England seized all church property. I mean, all those grand churches and cathedrals and colleges and hospitals even in England were Catholic, and they just took them. To rob a man is theft. To rob God is a sacrilege, and for this the penalty is excommunication. Yeah, did you know that? Did you know that actually all Anglicans are excommunicated? Well, actually all Protestants are excommunicated because they can't receive communion in a Catholic church, but they don't know that. Trust me, they don't know that. Restitution must be made before the Holy See can give absolution. Since it is the business of secular authorities under God to provide for the well-being of their subjects, the government is empowered by wise legislation to introduce gradual changes in regard to the holding of property. It can impose such taxes as are necessary for the common will of its subjects in proportion to their means. In other words, taxation is not in itself immoral, but it must be used for moral things, and, paying for abortions is certainly not, and it must be in proportion to their means. You can't just tax the rich so they have no money to buy votes for the Democrat Party. Thus, by heavy taxation of wealthy capitalists, it can alleviate poverty of the working classes. Well, that doesn't actually work out very well. But anyway, they did, in 1890, that was a popular theory. Moreover, St. Thomas Aquinas says that the world's riches are only intended for the preservation of human life. This end is not attained if they are already in the possession of individuals. Therefore, one is bound in his abundance to assist those who are in want. And that's what we call charity, and it's the duty of every Christian. The superfluity of the rich is the property of the poor. In other words, if someone has a lot of excess, they should give it to charity. They should try to take care of people. Now, in this day and age, I can't say give it to Catholic charities because they're facilitating human and drug trafficking and slavery. So let's try to find a good use for that. Thus, the government, exercising the right of guardianship, can do something toward just distribution of superfluous wealth. Now, let's put this in context of what he was saying at the time. Why did all our ancestors come to America? They couldn't buy property in Europe. Like the English. The lords had huge, vast estates, thousands of acres. The common man had no ability to buy property. They came here for property. You could live on the estate, of the lord of the manor, and you could work for him, and you could hope that your descendants could live in the same house and be blacksmiths or gamekeepers or farmers or whatever, right? But there was no upward mobility. There was no way to get an education and have a new career or anything like that. You were stuck in that position, and no matter how much money you saved, even if you could save money, there was no property to buy. Specifically because, during the Protestant Revolution, the Reformation, whatever, the Anglicans confiscated all that property and then redistributed it, put it in hands of big Protestant landowners. And the poor, many of whom are still Catholic, were consigned to poverty. So that's very much the case in England. That's somewhat the case in Germany, wherever our ancestors came from. And then you have the Irish potato famine, which I just explained, and the awful issues in Italy. Italy was always little states at war with each other, But everyone came here for economic opportunity. They came here to buy property. Now, when Father Sparago is writing this, he's in Czechoslovakia. He's looking at more of a system like England, for instance, where there's no access to land. And it would have been the right thing at that point to rectify the wrong for the government to take from those landowners and make that land available. To a point, they eventually did that with the allotment system in England. But it is always more moral for a person to give charity rather than taxation at gunpoint. And that's always the Catholic ideal. So now we get into sins against the Seventh Commandment. The Seventh Commandment expressly forbids theft, robbery, cheating, usury, injuring the property of another, detention of goods that have been found or lent, and the non-payment of debts. Theft is the secret purloining of another man's goods, contrary to the rational will of the owner. Judas was a thief. He had the purse and appropriated part of the common money. That's John 12:6. Few sins are more common than theft. And this fact may be accounted for in the first place by the covetousness of the human heart, and also by abundant opportunities afforded for stealing. Occasion makes a thief, but if a man steals when he's starving, or as the only means of saving his life in extremity, it is not to be reckoned as sin, provided he has the intention to restore what he has stolen when he is in better circumstances. Proverbs 6:30. Our Lord did not rebuke the apostles when in passing through a cornfield they plucked the ears of corn to eat the grain because they were hungry. Matthew 12:1. To conceal or purchase goods that are known to be stolen is to render oneself a partner in the sin. Robbery is theft accompanied by personal violence. If a robber kills or mortally wounds his victim, the crime is said to be robbery with murder. Of this, the robbers were guilty who attacked the Jew on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho in Luke 10:30. The forcible extortion of alms is also equivalent to robbery. Like alms for the poor, you're supposed to give out of charity. If someone forces you to do it, it's equivalent to robbery. Tell that to the Democrat Party. Cheating consists in injuring one's neighbor in his possessions by crafty means, for instance, by use of false weights and measures. The issue of counterfeit coin, the adulteration of food, the falsification of documents, the removal of boundary markers, smuggling or arson in view of obtaining insurance money. Let no man overreach or circumvent his brother in business. 1 Thessalonians 4:6. Usury consists in making use of the needy circumstances of another to one's own profit. The usurer is called a moneylender if he lends money at a high rate of interest to one who is in pecuniary monetary difficulties, or a speculator if he buys up corn and keeps it until a time of scarcity in order to sell it at a high price. Under the appearance of helping a man in need, the usurer involves him in greater complications. He is like a doctor who, instead of strengthening his patient, saps the little force he had, or like a spider that weaves a web more and more closely around the unhappy fly and sucks every drop of its blood. Usurers are murderers of the poor. They take from them their means of livelihood and thus deprive them of life. Very true, and that's one that Wall Street and the big banks don't like. Again, we need more Catholic teaching in this country. Willfully injuring another man's property, keeping back what one has found or what has been lent to, and refusing to pay one's debts is the equivalent of stealing. We may injure our neighbor in his property by setting on fire, by treading down his crops, damaging his goods, fishing or shooting on his grounds without permission to do so, etc. To keep what one has found and not to return what has been lent to an owner is theft. Joseph's brethren did well in directly taking back the money they found in their sacks. The more valuable the object one finds, the greater the obligation to give it to the owner, and if one does not know to whom it belongs, one ought to take steps to discover him. Many people are very careless in returning books. Absolutely, I've lost several books by loaning them. Instruments or implements which they have borrowed, and show displeasure if the owner asks for them. Be careful about lending and very careful about returning. The non-payment of debts is also a kind of stealing. It is a bad thing to get into debt. The debtor is like a man who, when his legs begin to fail him, hobbles onward with a crutch. But it is a sin to borrow and not to pay again. Psalms 36:21. Tell that to Joe Biden, who keeps trying to forgive student loan debt. I had to pay for my college, and now apparently I have to pay for someone else's because they borrowed a lot of money to go get a degree in gender studies. Many people get into debt to satisfy their cravings for amusement, to gratify their passions, or for the sake of dressing above their station, and they scarcely think themselves wrong. Tradespeople sin when they fraudulently declare themselves bankrupt, but most blameworthy of all are those who do not pay their servants and work people. Absolutely. As one who has been cheated a few times when I did some contract work and the person didn't want to pay me for it. This is the sin that cries to heaven. It is theft and a sort of murder, too, to keep back the wages of the poor laborer who lives on his daily earnings. The wages of him who hath been hired by thee shall not abide with thee until the morning. Leviticus 19:13. In other words, pay him right away. Pay him the price of his labor the same day. Deuteronomy 24:15. Owe no man anything but to love one another. Romans 13:8. We are in the danger of committing mortal sin if we take from our neighbor as much as he requires to support him one day in a manner suitable to his position. Our sin against our neighbor is greater or less in proportion to the wrong we do to him. To steal a few pence from one who is utterly destitute, or a few shillings from a laboring man, is a mortal sin. It is the equivalent of stealing a considerable sum from a rich man. It is also a sin to take trifling sums repeatedly from the same person, for in times they may make a large amount. One ought not to take the smallest thing that one does not own. Fidelity in small things is most important, for God punishes little sins, and unfaithfulness in small things leads to grave sins. By disregarding petty thefts, many a criminal has come to the gallows. And let's see, part 2, the duty of restitution or satisfaction. He who has purloined from his neighbor or wronged him in his property is under a strict obligation to restore the stolen good or make compensation for the damage done. Leviticus 6:1-5. A thief is not required to go himself and restore the stolen property to its owner. He may send it by the priest, who is pledged to secrecy. Another thing most people don't know: a priest will, if you stole something, you can actually ask the priest to go give it to the person, and he can't tell the person who stole it from him. I mean, that's actually the duty of the priest that nobody knows about anymore. And he will give him acknowledgement of its receipt. On one occasion, Clement Hofbauer, the apostle of Vienna, handed over something that had been stolen to his owner. The latter refused to take it, but Hofbauer rejoined, "It is not wise to allow a thief to retain what he has purloined, or he will think that stealing is no great offense. The following rules are to be observed. If the rightful owner of the stolen property is dead, it must be given to his heirs. And if there should be no heirs, it must be given to the poor or devoted to good works. If the thief cannot restore the whole, he must at any rate restore as much as he can. If poverty or other hindrance render the thief unable to make restitution immediately, he must at least resolve to do so as soon as possible, and he must make every effort to fulfill the resolution. If the thief cannot restore even a part of what he has stolen, he ought to at least pray for the individual he has wronged. If anyone has unwittingly gotten stolen goods in his possession, he is bound to give them up to the rightful owner as soon as he becomes aware that they were stolen. Thus, one who, whether by purchase or gift, has acquired possession of something that was stolen ought to give it back to its owner. If he does not know that it was stolen, he is said to be just a possessor, but if he does, then he is an unjust possessor. If the former be the case, not only must stolen property be itself restored, but also whatever may have been gained by it without any labor on his part. If the latter, any loss the rightful owner proprietor may have sustained through the loss of property must be made good. At any rate, it is well to refer the matter to one's confessor and to follow his counsel, for he stands toward us in the place of God. He who refuses either to give up stolen property or to compensate for the loss sustained will not obtain pardon of his sins from God nor absolution for the priest. He that will not render what he hath robbed shall die everlastingly. Ezekiel 33:15. Protestants say, well, someone can be a thief and just go to confession and the priest says you're forgiven, he's going to heaven. No, actually he has to make restitution. That's what they're saying here. He has to make restitution to the best of his ability. Unless he's on his deathbed, and then he can't, but to the best of his ability. It was not until Zacchaeus had declared his determination to make full restitution of all unjust gains that our Lord called him a son of Abraham. Luke 19:9. As long as one who has wronged his neighbor refuses to make reparation, though he entreats the divine pardon with tears, though he seeks to appease divine justice by fast and penance, his sin will not be remitted. Such a one, St. Augustine says, does not do penance, but only counterfeits it. Without restitution, there is no forgiveness. St. Alphonsus relates the story of a rich man who had gangrene in his arm and was near death. The priest urged him to restore the property he had acquired unjustly. He refused on the plea that by doing so, he would leave his 3 sons penniless. The priest bethought him of a stratagem. He said he knew of a means of a cure, but it was a costly one. The sick man declared no sum would be too great to procure it. The priest replied that some living person must allow his hand to be burned and while raw laid on that of the sufferer. The 3 sons were called, but neither one of them would do this for his father. Then the priest said, see, none of your children would hold his hand to the fire for a few moments for you, and you are willing to endure the torments of hellfire to all eternity for their sakes. This opened the man's eyes, and he went to confession and made restitution. What are the reasons which ought to deter us from transgressing the Seventh Commandment? The heathens of old held theft in abhorrence and punished it very severely. The Anglo-Saxons in the 6th century used to cut off the hand of thieves. In Hungary, they were sold as slaves. The Jews inflicted condign retribution on a thief. The man who at the taking of Jericho, in spite of the prohibition, carried away some of the spoils, was stoned to death by God's commandment. In former days, the laws of the church in regard to the sin of stealing were extremely rigorous. Even for a petty theft, retribution had to be made, and besides, it was expiated by fasting for a year on bread and water. Now that's a penance. God himself inflicts heavy chastisements on those who take what belongs to another, no matter how trifling the thing stolen. For whether it be great or small, the will to defraud is the same, and it is to the will that he looks. People who wrong their neighbor and his property generally come to shame and poverty, often die unrepentant, and are in danger of everlasting damnation. Confusion is upon the thief, Ecclesiastes 5:17. Stealing does not bring a man to honor, but to prison. Except for usury. George Soros has done very well by usury. But anyway, he'll pay for it one day. Thieves are generally caught sooner or later. Stealing is the way to poverty. Ill-gotten goods bring no blessing. He who steals another man's goods will lose his own. For when that which he acquired unjustly is taken from him, that which was honestly acquired will go too. Stolen goods are like fire, which not only vanishes in smoke, but reduces everything near it to ashes. When the Jews returned from Babylon, from the Babylonian captivity, there was great scarcity in the land. Some of the people profited by it to become rich. But when Nehemiah came from Babylon to Jerusalem, he was exceedingly angry and rebuked the usurers. He shook his clothes before the people and called upon God to shake every man out of his house and out of his possessions who did not restore all that had been unjustly exacted, so that what he had got by usury might vanish in the dust. He that soweth in iniquity shall reap evils. It's from Proverbs. The riches of the unjust shall be dried up like a river. That's either Ecclesiastes or Sirach. I can never tell by his abbreviation. Woe to him that heapeth together that which is not his own. Habakkuk. Injustice is even the cause of the fall of whole nations. Where are the ancient and mighty kingdoms of Babylon, of the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks and the great empire of Rome? They came to ruin because they sought to extend their limits unjustly. Look at the state of Italy in the present day. We were just discussing this. Since the Holy Father was robbed of his temporal possessions, yes, Italy took away, a lot of what the Vatican had. The taxation has been excessive, and a large portion of the population are starving. That's actually what led to the rise of Mussolini. Okay. Furthermore, thieves often come to a miserable end. Remember Judas' wretched fate, and what misery of mind, what torture of soul he endured before he hanged himself in despair. Matthew 28:5. Those who have stolen or embezzled money are rarely brought to repentance because they are unwilling to restore what they have taken. Even upon their deathbed they will not hear of making restitution. Beware, therefore, allowing yourself to touch what belongs to another. Moreover, if at the last day he will find no mercy who has not given of his substance to the needy, how much more pitilessly will he be judged who has taken from his neighbor what was his? It's according to St. Augustine. Thieves and the covetous shall not possess the kingdom of God. 2 Corinthians 6:10. The Muslims consider that he who does so much as pick an ear of corn from his neighbor's cornfield has done a disgraceful thing and will go to hell. The dread of everlasting damnation deters many from committing acts of injustice. Of this, the following story affords an example. A poor widow who had been defrauded of a plot of land belonging to her by a rich man, asked to at least be allowed to carry away a basket of earth. The man consented with a scornful smile. When the basket was filled, she further requested him to help her with it onto her back. The rich man attempted to raise it, but it was too heavy for him to lift. There, said the widow, if you find this basket of earth too great a weight, how will you bear the burden of the whole field for all eternity? The remark made such an impression on the rich man that he gave back the land to the woman. Fools indeed are they who play away their chance of heaven for the sake of earth's transitory riches. What doth it profit a man if he gains the whole world and suffer the loss of his own soul? Matthew 16:26. By stealing you may obtain money, but you lose God. You think of the gain and forget the loss. The honest man will prosper upon the earth. That's from Psalms. Tobias affords, this is from Tobit. Again, if you don't have Tobit in your Bible, you don't have a real Bible. Go get a real Bible, one that includes Tobit and wisdom and Sirach and all that, not the one that Martin Luther started cutting books out that he didn't like. Maccabees and several others. Tobias affords a model of upright conduct. Although he was blind and reduced to poverty, when he heard the bleating of a kid that had been given his wife, he immediately said, Take heed, lest perhaps it is stolen. Restore ye to its owners, for it is not lawful for us either to eat or to touch anything that cometh by theft. Tobit 2:21. God restored him to sight, and he lived 42 years longer. Tobit 14:1. The Lord will not afflict the soul of the just with famine. Proverbs 10:3. His ears are open to his prayers. That's from Psalms. And justice exalteth a nation, from Proverbs. Honesty is the best policy. All right, y'all. We will wrap it up there. And we got 3 more to go. So look forward to that. All right, y'all. Remember the words of St. Padre Pio. Pray, hope, and don't worry. And I'll talk to you next time.